What does it mean when someone says, take responsibility? Or they might say, you need to learn to think for yourself. And I would then say, so that you can take responsibility. I think that word is quite murky. Here are some thoughts I have. I was once a West Point graduate, studied electrical engineering, and so I'll just mention that to begin with, where they would wish us to take responsibility when we were being trained, or theoretically. I believe it goes back to our core premises we have. Some psychologists these days, if they bill themselves as cognitive behavioral therapists, strongly talk about core beliefs. Other people may refer to, in AA, stinking thinking. Or finally, there are those who refer alternatively again to the idea of misconceptions, logjams, if you will. Or they refer to something as a limiting belief. I believe it's all part and parcel of the same thing. We used to be taught in English class in high school that when you write an essay, you present premises and then conclusions. But if our premises are wrong, your conclusions will be at least partly wrong. So I think to take responsibility is to eliminate as many bad premises as we have in our heads. Of course, we can never be sure of anything, I believe, in life. To be certain that we can be certain of things is a bad premise in and of itself. And so the second part, I think, of taking responsibility is to know this and at a certain point act despite not being certain. For even going to war, whether it's as a nation or one family member against another or one spouse against another, is ultimately a decision not based on certainty, but taking a certain risk at a certain point, based on uncertain data, uncertain conclusions. So when someone urged me when I was 21 at West Point to take responsibility in terms of thinking for myself more, I was very confused. For some of my premises and actions were based upon what I thought were very valid data. And that's my next point here. Taking responsibility ultimately means deciding for ourselves and then acting, while still uncertain to a degree, deciding for ourselves what our premises are. For there's always a war, I think, in us between what we observe and think as a result of what we observe, the intuition aspect versus what others say, particularly certain people in a society, or maybe seemingly sometimes everybody around us in our subculture, country, or entire world, although there's not uniformity. So, for instance, if I held my hand up in front of my face and I said, "That's my hand," and 5 people around me said, "No, you're imagining it," taking responsibility would mean deciding who's probably more right and then ultimately acting upon that. Am I going to go with my view that, yes, that is my hand in front of my face? Or am I going to say, no, you are probably correct, because all 5 of you say one thing and it's only one person, me, who says the other. And that is my next point then. Ultimately, taking responsibility may, on certain points, contentions, premises, require standing alone or seemingly. When a number of people say something is one way and we believe from observation, thinking, intuition, that it is not so. So taking responsibility, so to speak, is simply a phrase, a catch-all phrase. We might say, well, everybody thinks this way, which surely is not true. There are others who may think alternatively, but you haven't heard from them. They may be too scared to speak up, may have lack of respectful language to do so, for one thing, or simply be afraid in general. They may be in the minority. So we may say, well, everybody is doing it except me, or thinking it except me, about this core premise, so I must be wrong. Because we might say, or someone might say to us, well, you must be delusional to think you're the only person who sees it this way. Or who do you think you are? You think you're special or something? The next point is, taking responsibility means deciding for oneself after appropriate clarification what is correct and what isn't as to what you were taught, not just the number of people around you saying something or another or doing it. For instance, in the Nazi regime in Germany in the 1930s, the prison guards were taught, via schooling of a sort, how to execute their prisoners. You might say they were simply following instructions, but moreover they were acting upon what they were taught. Taking responsibility in that case would be deciding for themselves, was what was taught to me correct or not? At least to the point where they decided what to do about it, follow orders or not, or something or another. I think the ultimate, when there are a number of people saying something in one direction or doing something very commonplace and very little to the contrary, we ask ourselves, well, why hasn't someone spoken up about this or that yet? Surely the majority must be right thus. There is no minority dissent, no minority commenting going on. Or you say to yourself, well, if this were incorrect, some scientist would have figured it out by now, and we would have heard a contrary view, and it would have been corrected by now in this modern age. We couldn't possibly have a mistake so big and it not be corrected by now. I must be crazy, is what you would say, or full of it. I think the fallacy in this, though, is to assume, first of all, that everybody thinks the same way just because no minority comment is being made. And secondly, the mistake of believing that speaking up is of only one sort, that there's no difference between speaking up with disrespect versus speaking up with respect. And therein lies, I believe, one of the biggest flaws in societies. We may see drug use of a non-chemical based nature, escapism call it, for one thing, and nothing being said about it. We wonder, well, this can't be escapism because it's so commonplace and nobody has said a thing. But maybe that is because the very few who have get their heads lopped off, so to speak, in some Me Too movement, say. They get called a hothead, they get called grandiose, they get called panicky, they get called people with an axe to grind. And I think then, underlying all this, we wonder, well, what good is it to speak up under those conditions? Unfortunately, I think the reality is far too few people can speak up with respect, with language that is not morally condemning, blaming, and so on. And so we have yet very few examples of people who can do this, and we have no conception that it can be done, and nothing to work toward. I believe our words, for instance, are the most difficult thing when it comes to describing people with respect. And so very little gets spoken of. that ought to be spoken of. And thus, much goes without being spoken about at all. And we tend thus to think this must be appropriate, accurate as to reality. When in fact there's a complete disconnect here. So I believe, once again, taking responsibility is deciding for ourselves after an appropriate period of time, based on some level of uncertainty still, what we think is probably the case as to some premise, some core conclusion about life. Regardless of the number of people thinking the opposite, seemingly, when in fact another core part of taking responsibility is understanding something here, that many people have a warm, fuzzy feeling that something doesn't add up, but they don't say anything because they lack respectful terminology to say anything, and they know they would be called disrespectful, a hothead, and so on. And so we have the misconception that what is out there is appropriately accurate to reality because nobody has said anything contrary. When in fact, maybe that's simply because so very few people have the respectful words to do so. And so most people have very little confidence they would get anywhere at all. Saying something with disrespect words. My thoughts then.